What's going on, football fans? It's your boy J.R. Clark back again with another little mini episode, a little deep dive, I guess you could say, for pound for pound. As you could probably tell by the thumbnail, I think today we're going to talk about the secondary, but in lieu of because what got me thinking about the secondary, I guess you could say, is the draft, right? The combine has now come and gone, and some of the guys didn't test as good as we thought that they might, or maybe they didn't show the athleticism that we thought that we were going to get out of them. Especially one that come to mind is AJ Espinosa. He didn't test very well at all, and you apply that with the tape on him, he might not be a surefire first rounder that we necessarily thought. Now, he may still be. I'm not one to really say. So that got me to thinking, well, maybe they go in a different direction in the first round. Maybe they go secondary in the first round. Because there are a handful of mid-tier edge rushers that I believe you're going to be able to get in the second to third round of the draft this year, because only one clear-cut, freak of nature, generational type talent in this draft, and that's a Chase Young, who's obviously going to be gone well before we pick. So that leads me to think that, maybe if we can't get a Javon Kinlaw, who right now in this part of the draft process is definitely my clear-cut favorite, maybe we shouldn't take an edge rusher in the first round, right? Because there's a good possibility after this weekend's combine that a guy like K'Lavon Chaisson might be gone before we pick. So if we can't get a defensive tackle and Kinlaw, or because I believe Derek Brown will be gone before we pick for sure. So I'm operating under the assumption that Chaisson and Kinlaw are both going to be gone by the time we pick. So that got me to thinking, what if we were to go with a quarterback in the first round? I know that has been a super popular pick or draft choice for mockers for quite some time now, the last few years really. Definitely since we let Robert Alford go last year. That has become a pretty popular pick for the mock draft crowd. So I got to thinking, here's where I normally would be starting to break down a pick that I have in mind, but I haven't gotten there yet as far as who I would think. My partner earlier just tweeted out a mock draft of his own where he had Trevon Diggs out of Alabama. Now that could be an interesting pickup for us there in the first round. Or the C.J. Henderson out of Florida. He tested really well at the combine. Pairing that with his tape, that might be a great pick for us there. So that got me to thinking about, well, what do you do on the field, right? What do you put together as far as our talent goes, right? If you're keeping, I'm assuming you're going to keep Trufant. You're going to have Keanu Neal come back. You got Isaiah Oliver, Kendall Sheffield, Jordan Miller when he comes back from suspension. You got DeMonte Casey and Ricardo Allen. You could have a very formidable secondary. So when thinking about that, I was like, well, man, I wonder what really sparked the defensive turnaround in the second half of the season. So I'm going to throw some numbers out there for you. I'm going to throw some stats out there for you, for all you stat people out there. Once we made the switch and brought Raheem Morris over to the back to the defensive side of the ball, if I'm not mistaken, he was kind of put back in charge of the defensive backs along with calling plays as well, splitting his time with Jeff Ulbrich, obviously. So I looked at the first 8 games of the season. There was the opposing team had a 71.5% completion rate against our defensive backs. That's crazy. I mean, there's quarterbacks who don't throw for that high of a completion percentage in a season. So I was like, man, that's a little rough. So I compared and averaged out the percentage on the second half, the back half of the season after we brought Raheem Morris over to that side of the ball, and it dropped to 60.8. That's almost an 11% drop. Now, if you want to sit here and try to tell me what was part of the defensive turnaround, it wasn't necessarily the defensive front, okay? It was, it was the secondary that really, came together and, really shut down, right? Really locked down on opposing teams to the tune of, in the first half, they gave up on average through the air 261 yards. In the second half, that dropped down to 228 yards a game. Now I know you're telling me, JR, well, that's only like 40-something yards, but still, that's big. That's first downs. That's conversions of third downs. That's getting off the field that you can almost squarely lay at the feet of the secondary. You went from scoring 2.3 touchdowns per game to only scoring 1.1 touchdown per game. Again, these are big drops for from the first half of the season to the second half of the season. Now I thought to myself, I was like, well, daggum. So was it the defensive front? Or were they starting to, get some more pressure? Or were they starting to shut down the run? And not really. I mean, the front seven played about like it did in the first half of the season to the second half of the season. At least from what the numbers say, right? Yards that the front seven was given, this is like basically rushing yards. All right, and that's what I'm gauging as the front seven. You were giving up 118 yards on average in the first half of the season versus 103. So it come down a little bit, come down almost 20 yards a game. The yards per attempt went from 3.7 yards per attempt to 4.9 yards per attempt. But that stat's a little misleading. And the reason why it's a little misleading because your attempts went from 31 rushing attempts to 21 rushing attempts per game. So the front seven was doing a little bit better job of shutting down the run. But what I'm getting at is I believe that the biggest defensive turnaround in the second half of the season, what the catalyst, I guess you could say, for the defensive turnaround in the second half of the season was more put on the secondary. That's why I think it's very imperative to keep Damontae Kazee and Ricardo Allen on the field at all times. Now, that brings up an interesting point of what are you going to do with Keanu Neal? Like, he's coming back. He's on track to be healthy. Do you start to limit his play some? Do you use him in sub packages? Do you start going with a big nickel? I'm not sure. I mean, you almost have to do something like that, right? I mean, Damontae Kazee has been too good at free safety to take off the field. Do you let Ricardo Allen play from more of like a hybrid, like roving position, something like a slot corner or an extra strong safety? I mean, because he did real good towards the line of scrimmage to where his field generalness, I guess you could say, his leadership could really shine and helping in diagnosing plays. So you don't necessarily want to bring him off the field either. But you got a first round pick tied up in Keanu Neal. And he is shown to be a difference maker when he is on the field. I mean, he's your enforcer. I mean, just look back at, your Seattle days where Dan Quinn made his bones, made his name. What'd you have? You had the Legion of Boom, right? You had Richard Sherman. You had Earl Thomas. And you had Cam Chancellor. At times you had, Malcolm Smith or the other corners weren't nearly as memorable as Richard Sherman, obviously. But the main engine that drove that train was the combination of Earl Thomas and Cam Chancellor. So you have your Cam Chancellor role in Keanu Neal. So you can't just not have him on the field. Now, there have been people who've suggested that you might want to take a Keanu Neal and play him in a hybrid outside linebacker strong safety role, which is always possible. I mean, he plays closer to the line of scrimmage than he does, he plays more in the box, closer to the line of scrimmage than he does dropping back. So he's already kind of used to that. I think that the Falcons were gearing up to play more of a big nickel anyway, because you had J.J. Wilcox, who we signed in the offseason and then he messed his knee up, I believe. Either way, got put on injured reserve before he even had a chance to play. So I know you probably initially brought him in to be an insurance policy for Keanu Neal if he wasn't ready, but I also feel like that they were gearing up to play, more big nickel. And that is a trend that has popped up across the league. So if Keanu Neal comes back healthy with what you have seen out of DeMonte Casey and what you've seen out of the pairing of DeMonte Casey and Ricardo Allen, I think that's exactly what you end up doing. Now, what does that spell for Keanu Neal in the long term? I'm not 100% sure. I don't know if he mainly becomes a big nickel safety and a hybrid outside linebacker strong safety. I don't know what that would be for his market, but he surely could be valuable to our team. And so that will be interesting going forward. So to tie it back into what I was talking about earlier in the video, what if we made the secondary the primary of our defense? And what I mean by that is, what if we made the secondary the strong suit of the defense? I mean, make our own version of the Legion of Boom, our own version of the no-fly zone, right? I mean, make it to where quarterbacks are scared to throw. Receivers are scared to come across the middle and, catch a ball, whether it be receivers or running backs or tight ends. I mean, if we can make a team one-dimensional, whether it be passing one-dimensional or running one-dimensional, that's essentially what a defense is trying to do, right? So I think it could finally give our defense an identity that it hasn't had. Like, it hasn't had an identity, well, it hasn't had one since 2008 for sure. The last time it had an identity was, the dome defenders and the grits blitz and those guys. And that was all due to pass rushing. But I don't see the pass rushing getting fixed this offseason. Now, you're going to let Vic Beasley walk. They've already said that. I don't see where you're going to have the cap money to get the defensive end out of Jacksonville. You might get a Robert Quinn, maybe. You might get Marcus Golden, who's been, quietly productive. He's a defensive end that nobody's really talking about. So, with that being said, I'm not sure that you're necessarily going to fix the pass rush this offseason. I mean, you're going to hope that Tack McKinley recovers from his, yet again, shoulder surgery, and that maybe you start to get something out of John Kaminsky. Also, you got to figure that Grady Jarrett's going to get you 6-7 sacks from the middle. So I think it's time to maybe shift our identity. And if we can become more of a lockdown team, more of a shutdown team, that could benefit the pass rush as well. I think that's part of what benefited the pass rush. Because the secondary came on in the second half like it did, there's no coincidence that then Vic Beasley came on. Like, he had time to get to the quarterback. So those things go hand in hand. And I don't see where you're going to get one, not without the other. But I think if you have a chance in this draft or even in free agency to bolster this secondary to make it elite, I think you take it. And if that's possibly signing a Chris Harris, which I don't think we have the money for, I'm just throwing that name out there as one of the people who, could come in and help this team tremendously. I think you take it. And that's just my opinion, especially if you're not going to be able to get your hands on an elite pass rusher, which I don't know if there really is one in this draft. I think you got Chase Young and I think you got Kayvon Chaisson, who have the potential. Past that, I think you have some really good, solid rotational guys that could come in and can contribute and maybe in 2 or 3 years be a force. You know, kind of like a Marcus Golden is a little bit of a force. So it'll be interesting to see what they do. And I really hope y'all enjoyed the thoughts that I had here. Always, y'all can hit me up on Twitter. You can it's at Grim1128. That's GRIMM1128. If you hit me up, I'll respond back to you. I appreciate a follow. That's always kind of cool. We thank y'all for the ones who have been supporting us. Whether it's the views during the live stream, which we're trying to line up more guests and stuff like that as we go on. But
Falcons flies out!